Modern conservative politics are based around this idea that America lost something, and we used to have a shared culture, a moral center, and a unified way of life that has now been lost, that we have to get back to. You hear about the monoculture, that we used to have a single culture that has now been broken up by, diversity or whatever they're talking about. The reason why conservative politics is always kind of flimsy, and the reason why it falls apart under basic scrutiny, is the fact that it's based on this idea of a monoculture. And this whole idea is completely false at its core. America never had a monoculture. I mean, just historically, go back to the very beginning. This country was based on diversity and pluralism. I mean, why do you think there were 13 colonies as opposed to one big colony? There were 13 colonies because of diversity, because of plurality. Some colonies were Quakers or Protestant, Catholic, Baptist. It was diverse culturally. I mean, obviously there were African slaves, English settlers, French, Irish, German immigrants, people coming from everywhere. The mercantile North, plantation South, different ways of life were coexisting. What we had was 13 colonies that barely came together to win a war against the British. I mean, people talk about the Constitution being a foundational document for this country, but there was no Constitution in the beginning. They won the war, and then it was 3 whole years before they even got around to making the Constitution. And then the Constitution took 9 months to ratify, and even then it barely got ratified. 9 out of 13. America was founded on disagreement, a barely held together coalition that agreed just enough to stay together. I mean, modern conservative politics, the Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump strain, is really based on a kind of nostalgia for the past. They're looking back towards, the values that they're looking back towards is always the 1950s. The 1950s are seen in American politics as kind of the last simple era before everything got complicated. The problem with this is that this really is based on TV. I mean, Ronald Reagan was an actor. He was from the TV era. The thing that when Americans think about the 1950s, the thing they picture is Happy Days. They picture a TV show about the 1950s when everything looks clean and nice. What's so weird to me about Happy Days, though, is that, I grew up in the 90s, so I remember watching Happy Days on syndication, like Nick at Night or whatever. I thought Happy Days was a show from the 1950s. It wasn't until later that I found out that Happy Days was a show from the 1970s about the 1950s. The 1970s is a very dark time in America. Economic recession, Cold War politics. So people were dreaming for a simpler time. They go back and they thought back to the 1950s, and that's how you end up with Happy Days. But the 1950s were not a simple time in America. The 1950s were very diverse. This was not pre-diversity America. The 1950s is when you get the civil rights movement. It's when you get the beginning of women's liberation, white flight to the suburbs, Puerto Ricans showing up in New York City. And this wasn't the beginning of something. This was a natural continuation of what America always was. The civil rights movement did not start diversity. It revealed it. It showed what was always there. There was never a monoculture. It was always all of these competing factions that were held together by just barely shared purpose. I mean, when you hear conservatives talk about missing the monoculture, there was no monoculture for them to miss. What they miss was cultural dominance. They miss Happy Days. They miss the idea that one group got to tell the story, as opposed to a bunch of competing groups, which were always there. The irony is that, conservatives spent decades pushing free market capitalism and individualism. And then they wonder why things got a little fractured. They complain that people aren't on the same page anymore, while also pushing private school vouchers. They want people to be on the same page, while also forcing them to scramble for the basic necessities of life: healthcare, housing. And then they wonder why people are fighting. People are fighting because you made them fight. You wanted a free market economy, but without free market ideas. And that's not how it works. Once it breaks apart, it's broken.